body other than the face itself.
There are, in fact, 4 different types of, what we think of as Sasquatch or Bigfoot.
Very wide, pronounced nose. There was also a very ominous odor.
Phase 1 is to identify opportunities. I walked into a small clearing in less than 10-15 feet away from this enormous creature, and it scared the living hell out of me. Phase 2 is conducting investigations both of witnesses and locations. The size of the thing, it was, 4 or 5 feet across the shoulders. Phase 3 is profiling research areas, what's there, how they move, feeding, things like that. About 8 feet tall, I guessed around 800 pounds. It was massive. I had no idea that anything like that existed. Phase 4 is create an intercept plan. I decided to shoot in the air to see if maybe it would scare it off. Phase 5 is the intercept and resolve the issue phase. It didn't do anything, didn't react, and then I heard a noise from my right rear, and from out behind some brush come another one and walked over by the first one. That's when I decided to do what the dog did. I took off running. Welcome to Witness of the Unknown. Hello everyone. Welcome to the weekly chat that Brian and I have. Brian, how you doing, buddy?
Good, good. I hope everybody's Christmas was good and okay and everything.
I do too, yes. Well, I know you said you did a lot of traveling. Did you have a chance to, you always have great questions, so I'm sure you have a list of them.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I wanted to mention is that anybody that's listening, if you want to go ahead and relay any questions for me that you want me to ask Will on these chats, feel free to go ahead. My email address is just orlandooutsider, one word, orlandooutsider@yahoo.com. So it's great that me and Will can have these conversations, but definitely if anybody has any questions that they want to hear on this broadcast and they want to ask, then feel free. Again, orlandooutsider@yahoo.com.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that before we came on. I'll actually post that in the comments section where people can get that in. Yeah, Brian and I have been talking about doing, and we are going to do a live call-in show, probably. I'm thinking once a month. We'll see how it goes, maybe more than that, but for now that's kind of my thinking. But before that gets going, if anybody has questions or topics they want us to bring up or just anything, get a hold of Brian, and that's what we'll do. We'll incorporate those into our discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Will, here's kind of the first thing that I was wondering about, or that not that I was wondering about, that I was really, really fascinated about, because I'm kind of going through your book again, and when you talk about the town of Stevenson in Skamania County, I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it, Skamania County. They actually passed an ordinance at one point that declared it illegal to kill a Sasquatch, but it wasn't necessarily for the reasons that you and I might think, or the other listeners might think. Do you want to explain that?
Yeah, correct. This was back in, and I believe, I'm looking at it right offhand, I think it was 1968, 67, 68 time frame, and it had nothing to do with protecting the Sasquatch. What it was now, I'd mentioned at one point, going through, in one of the other chats that we did, talking about going through newspapers, for old articles, going to the newspaper location where they're printed and published, and seeing what they had Bigfoot-wise. And I knew that in Skamania County. The newspaper out there was the Skamania County Pioneer. And I had mentioned, going in there, and they said, oh, sure, there's this, it was a closet, and they just piled all these old newspapers in there. And I had to go digging through. Well, I got to meet Roy Kraft not long before he passed away, and Roy was the editor. And I believe he owned the Skamania County Pioneer for a long time. But anyway, during the time that ordinance was drafted and passed, I believe he's the one that actually brought it up to the Skamania County Board of, what do they call them, commissioners or something like that. But anyway, there was a guy there, and he was somewhat of a crackpot, and he would go out like some of these people do today, and he'd stand at the edge of logged clear cuts, and he would imagine, he'd say you'd see one Bigfoot, then two, then a dozen, and they just kind of pop out of thin air in front of this guy. And he started getting some of the other locals convinced that they needed to go out and shoot him. And this was during hunting season. So, and I can attest to this. My dad and I were shot at deer hunting one time right next to my pickup out in an open clearing. So, if people have trouble distinguishing what they're shooting at, supposedly shooting at a four-legged animal with antlers, and they shoot a grown man next to a pickup, you can only imagine what kind of things that happen if they go out shooting at a, shadowy creature at best, in poor light conditions. So they decided to draft that ordinance, and at the time it was a felony, and they had to redraft it in 1984 because counties cannot enact felony law. Only state legislatures can do that. So they had to make it a misdemeanor, but it's still on the books. And actually, it's more of a tourist item. When you go to Skamania County, you can actually go to the Skamania County Courthouse and obtain a copy of it for a few dollars.
Yeah. Well, there definitely have been a lot of hunting accidents. I've heard. Well, hey, Dick Cheney, didn't he shoot somebody hunting one time? Or
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah. So there have been a lot of hunting accidents. So it in retrospect, it does kind of make sense that they would do something like that. Although it's not exactly what a lot of people might think it was. But
no, and at the time, I mean, the sheriff, the Skamania County Sheriff, Bill Klosner, there were a lot of sightings around that area, and still are, as far as I'm aware, in that region. They had this particular rash of sightings and track finds, and short in the story was they got some dogs, professional tracking dogs, and he and I don't remember however many people, they tracked one of these creatures for more than 5 miles through the snow, and eventually lost the trail. But the sheriff took it fairly serious, and a lot of locals did too. But when it came to the Skamania County commissioners, of course they didn't. So it was more of an act of keeping the peace, keeping people from shooting each other than protecting the Sasquatch.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, another part in this book too that I want to go through, because you have a whole chapter where you talk about the first pioneers, or the last generation, sort of, and you go through, obviously Patterson and Gimlin got the film, but then you talk about Renee, John Green, Titmus, and then here's what I found interesting, and maybe if you could elaborate on each of these. Okay, so Renee Hinden, you say he's the first to basically determine if there was anything with the subject in the first place, and if we should go investigate it, and if anything could be. And then you also talk about how a lot of people have this reputation of him, or he has a reputation from a lot of others as being this guy that was really stubborn and wouldn't listen to anybody if they didn't agree with him. But as you say, that wasn't the case. He was just more like, you have to have 100% concrete evidence.
Yeah, he was a real stickler for credibility, and he understood that something that was, barely believable at best.
Right.
It's less so today than it was back then. But, and of course, when he emigrated from Switzerland in the mid-50s, and I've told this before, and it's available out there, about his background. The nuts and bolts of it was he and the farmer he was working for, he lived on the East Coast, or the eastern part of Canada. They overheard while they were having a meal on the radio this story about some mountaineers who were going to the Himalayas to hunt for the Yeti. And he made the comment, wow, wouldn't that be interesting to be part of that? And the farmer just kind of didn't even look at him. He just said, yeah, they have those things out in British Columbia. You don't have to go that far. And the year later, he packs up and he moves to British Columbia on the other side of Canada. And what de Hinden was really the first guy. Now, there were a couple others who had some interest in the subject years prior to that, but they really didn't do anything with it. I think one guy actually maybe put out something called a Bigfoot Bulletin, but it didn't really get any traction. Nobody really paid any attention. De Hinden was a force of nature. I mean, in every sense of the word. When he got his teeth into something, that was it. He would exhaust every avenue in searching out whatever evidence he could. So he started looking around, talking to people, going to libraries, seeing how much information there was about these creatures. And he made the determination that there was sufficient evidence or sufficient information supporting the possible existence of these things. So, he began in earnest looking for them. And then he eventually linked up with John Green, who was the newspaper editor in Harrison Hot Springs. And the two of them linked up and as a team. And this was about the time also that things in Bluff Creek, California started up. So that's really where they sort of made their fame, was in all the activity going on there.
Right. Right. And that kind of like segues into John Green, who you say too was he brought with him journalistic experience,
right,
and helped expose the topic to the public, which a lot of other people couldn't do.
Yeah, de Hinden was the kind of the nuts and bolts on the ground investigator. A lot of common sense. He would really think things out. Green was much more polished. He was educated and knew how to present a topic to the public in a very professional manner. So between the two of them, they were able to really make this subject eventually kind of a household word. And then there were, you mentioned Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin, who were not major players in the subject. Patterson was interested, and he did find tracks a few years prior to getting the film, but he wasn't a major player. I mean, he would search Mount St. Helens and the surrounding areas, did find some evidence, but never really achieved the exposure or the expertise that Green and de Hinden did as a team.
Right. And then you also say too that Bob Titmus was maybe the best Sasquatch hunter of all time. Like, what made him different?
I think at least during that decade, from the late 50s to the late 60s, because he was in that area a lot and was very observant when it comes to the details, behaviors, and different kinds of sign and things like that. And I think it was because being a taxidermist, he probably knew a little bit more about animals and behaviors than, Green or de Hinden did. But the three of them worked together, and de Hinden and Titmus really didn't get along very well. But and when he and Green split, Green and Titmus did a lot of work together.
Yeah. Well, actually, I have a follow-up question to that too. But also, what about Al Hodgson? Because he was the main guy for Bluff Creek, right? He was the main guy that kind of monitored that area at the time, right?
Right, and Al did find tracks at least once. I think more than that, if I remember right. But in 1963 or 64, he and a couple other people were up in that area. I think just on the off chance he stopped along a road, they were talking, and I was trying to remember how he explained this. I think he did in the interview how he explained it that I did with him.
Yeah.
But they pulled off the road, and he went down and checked the creek, and there were these tracks, and he cast at least one of them down there.
Yeah.
But Al was, Al's importance was the fact that he sort of connected the dots. He connected all the players together, and a lot of the things that did happen and got reported through Green's books probably wouldn't have been so had Al Hodgson not been told by a lot of the people who found things, and then Al would, contact Green and de Hinden and Titmus and people like that and get them out there so they could collect that information.
Right. It's kind of funny, like being a big movie guy like myself, It's like a movie has to. It's not just one person. It has to be a multiple of things, multiplicity of people coming together and doing various roles and everything.
Absolutely, and there were a few other minor players in that area too that were connected with them, but like a lot of people, they don't didn't stay in the subject long, but there were some other people.
Yeah. No, I was going to ask you though on this little subject. I actually didn't even write it down here on one of my questions, but I know at one point you did say that at least early on, I'm not sure about the later years, but early on when you first met Green and DeHinden, you said that there was sort of an animosity between them. And I was just curious as to what that might have been.
Yeah, I didn't know at the time. I mean, I was, a 17-year-old kid, so I didn't know.
Yeah.
I was just starstruck by the fact that these two guys who were famous, they were, one wrote the books and the other was in all the books, and, they wanted me to come to their camp and meet them, and I was just sort of, struck pretty good by that. But I didn't know there was. I mean, I could sense there was a little friction between them, but because the whole time I was at the camp, they rarely, and I mean rarely, spoke to one another. It was almost like there was a wall, that one, DeHinden and the guy he was with, Dennis Gates, they only really went to Green's trailer once or twice that I can remember. And one of those times was to bring me over to introduce me to John Green. And I went in the trailer, and there were a couple local men who were there, and they're talking to him. And then as soon as he made a quick introduction, DeHinden left. He closed the door and was gone. And Green never approached him, as far as I recall. But I later found out that through Renee that, all the years that they worked together, of course, this was 1975 that I met them. So through, like I said, the late 50s on, when they worked together, and Green started making money with these books by, from 1968 on, I think Renee got a little upset that, first of all, in the early books, Green didn't give him credit for the photos. All the photographs were Renee's. And then when Green was making money, he didn't even offer to pay Renee anything for the use of his photographs. So that really kind of stuck in Renee's craw, I think, and that was the gist of the separation between the two of them.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess that makes sense in retrospect.
And the thing was, and what made Renee, I'm sorry, what made Renee angry was there was a local archaeologist by the name of Don Abbott, and when they would come back from Bluff Creek, now Renee would take, per Green, he wanted Renee to take black and white photos, which is why you see black and white photos in Green's books, and Green would take the color, when supposedly the color photos never turned out because his nephew, did stuff to him or whatever. Renee would go give Don Abbott copies of the photographs he took of the tracks for his files, and then he would go home. And then Green would come in later and get copies of those photographs to use in his books, and Renee didn't know that.
Oh, wow.
So that was what made Renee angry, and that was the cause of the split.
Yeah, that does make sense in retrospect, I guess. Yeah. Hey, I was going to ask you too. First of all, anybody that's listening, definitely go to Will's YouTube site and subscribe, because not only can I know that Will, you put up not only some of our videos here or some of our discussions here, but also some of the witness accounts and some of the other things that are really, really interesting. So if you're interested in the subject, I highly recommend just subscribing to Will's YouTube site. And actually, on that note too, Will, I was listening to one of the interviews from YouTube that you did. It was with the guy from Nebraska. I forget his name offhand.
Sean, yeah.
Yeah, Sean. I thought it was Paul, but no, Sean. Okay. But that's a very, very interesting interview, because he talks about a number of things that I hadn't really thought of. I've heard a lot of these things, but first of all, the thing about climbing trees, because he says that there's evidence that in his tree stand they ripped off the bark of the first part of the tree, but there's evidence that maybe they had climbed up the tree. And what is your take on, or your research on these creatures climbing trees and so forth?
Well, they will, especially the younger ones. We hear that quite a bit with, through reports, witnesses. Excuse me. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly reasonable if they would climb trees.
Yeah, I'm sure they can. It's just that most of the sightings you hear are from the ground. So, although I have read some sightings where they have been up in trees, maybe, but that's kind of interesting that these things can also, maybe some of them at least, can maybe climb trees and so forth. The other thing though that he mentions is that when he saw the creature, there were no whites to the eyes. Now, this is something that I've read about in a lot of encounters, and I'm just curious as to how many people that you've talked to that say this, that there are no whites to their eyes, that their eyes are just completely black.
Quite a few, actually.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I don't know if that's the variation, between the species or what the reasoning for that. But then you look at gorillas and other large primates; it's kind of the same way.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I'm certainly not doubting his story or anything, but I'm just curious. Because sometimes I hear the opposite. Sometimes I hear, oh, well, there are definitely whites to their eyes. But I guess that might, again, depend on types and so forth, right?
Yeah, I think it could, sure.
And then there's also that theory, too, out there that say that their eyes will glow red or something like that.
We talked about that a long time ago with the coloration. I've seen quite a bit of eye shine over the years, and it's always been either on the verge of being a pale bluish color, more white, but almost with a tinge of bluish color, or amber. Mostly the amber color, but it depends on the light source.
Yeah.
Because there are light sources that will cause the red coloration. But even going back to John Green's work, out of all the cases that he collected where there was eye shine, there was only 7 that mentioned red. The rest were this amber color. So
right.
I tend to think it was the light source.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm sure the same thing is true probably with the people that don't see the whites in their eyes. It probably is dependent on light and the time of day, and if it's pitch black, dark out, and everything.
Exactly right. Yeah, there's lots of variations, a lot of factors that would play into that. But and absolutely, they do not glow, internally. So they're not emanating light from their eyeballs.
Yeah.
Some people actually believe that.
Yeah, yeah. Some of those other shows will purport that, but again, we won't say any names. But the other thing too that Sean talked about, which is really, really that I found interesting, is the fact, and I've heard this before too. So Sean is just reiterating what I've heard a lot of other witness encounters, or what I've read about a lot of witness encounters, which is that the lips of their mouth are sometimes twice as wide as a normal human's.
Well, the width of the mouth is very wide, and there typically aren't lips per se. They're very thin, they're not lips like what we have. And among primates, what we have is very unique. Because typically primates don't have lips like we do.
Okay, but their mouths are twice
are very wide. Oh, more than twice. Very wide.
Wow.
Very big mouths.
Okay, so that kind of leads me, and again, this doesn't have to do just with the size of the mouth, but that might be part of it, though. But I was going to ask you, how loud are their screams? Because I've heard some stories where they can be like 2 miles away, and witnesses can still hear their screams.
I've heard them from many different ranges. I've heard them, or I've estimated, and of course you don't know exactly, but using landmarks, you can kind of get an idea where you can hear them several miles away. I've also heard them very close, and it's ear-shattering when they're that close. I mean, within a few hundred yards.
Yeah. I mean, didn't you say one time that you interviewed somebody who had their doors closed, their windows closed, and they could still hear him from like a mile away or something?
It wasn't an interview. It was the Puyallup Screamer.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I remember one time John Green gave me a copy of some screams they had recorded there. And the locals actually recorded. It was in somebody's house. And they had all the windows and doors closed. And it sounded like this thing was right outside, maybe not more than 100 or 2 feet or so away from the house, when actually they said it was actually a quarter of a mile away. Very clear, right? It sounded like it was right outside the window. Like I said,
Wow.
maybe 100 feet away, but it was actually a quarter of a mile.
Wow. And they could hear, like, they could feel the windows vibrating
I don't know. I never talked to the actual people who recorded it, but Green was fairly impressed with the recording.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I can imagine. I mean, and I know we've talked about this before, but the reasons for the screams, it might be to alert the other, I guess, members that are not there, that are out there scattered to now it's time. Now it's hunting time.
It could be, I mean, it could be a variety of things. It could be a warning of an approaching threat.
Yeah.
Could be, a challenge from another group.
Hmm.
I mean, there's just a number of things. Could indicate it's time to start a particular hunt or something like that, to move to a different feeding area. I mean, there's just a lot of different things it could mean.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's a wide variety of noises they make. So,
Well, what do you mean by wide variety? Like, I mean, besides screams.
well, there's a bunch of different things they'll make. I mean, they have quite a repertoire of noises. When you look at what chimps and gorillas, the kind of noises they make a lot of different kinds of noises.
Yeah.
And without knowing, I mean, you'd have to really closely study a particular group of these things, just like with apes and monkeys, to know exactly what those sounds mean to the individuals in that group. Because there might be similar noises, but they might mean different things to a different group, even though they're the same kind of noises.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, yeah, definitely, because a lot of people still try to interpret the different screams of lions and so forth, and how some of them might be more high pitch and some of them might be low pitch, and they might mean different things and so forth. So
And going and a little further with that, going a little further in that, to address, everybody wants to try going out screaming and doing what I guess the BFRO calls call blasting and this stuff. Here's the problem with that. Because the noises are group specific, any noises outside of that group, what the noises that group makes,
different.
they're
Yep.
going to know that's not one of them.
Right.
So they're going to be on guard, and they're certainly not going to respond to that.
That's exactly what I was going to follow up with that, which is those people that record or bring those recordings to the forest and they just play that.
It's pointless.
Yeah, it's pointless because they're going to know that's not one of their group.
If anything, that's going to either drive them away or it's going to put them on high alert.
Exactly.
They're not going to. They're not stupid. They're not going to play into something like that when it could very well. And it's, the first thing in their minds is probably going to be, this is a threat.
Yeah, yeah. And I've also heard on some other shows too, well, hey, if you want to attract a Sasquatch in the forests, in the middle of the woods, well, just go out there and play some baby noises, play a recording of baby noises, and because that's going to attract them. And it might get them curious, but like you said, I think it's just going to put them on high alert. I don't think it's going to do any good. If anything, it's going to put you in danger, I think.
Well, and especially if they're, let's say they're attracted to a home with small children or a baby. There's a difference. If you go out randomly in the woods playing noises like that, that's going to put them on alert because that's something that doesn't belong in that environment. They know where those kind of noises belong.
Yeah.
Like I said, they're not stupid. They know where certain things are supposed to be. So you can't just go out and do something artificial and expect to get, first class results from it.
Exactly. Yeah. Hey, switching topics a little bit, you mentioned that I think you said in one of your interviews, or maybe I just read this somewhere in one of your interviews, that you think that when the creatures are born, they might start off as being completely black in color, but then some of them change later. As they get older, they change to maybe burgundy red, or even completely red, or even white in some cases, maybe white as they get older. Do you think that's kind of true for all of them, or do you think that it might be specific to a certain type?
It kind of looks that way across the board. Typically, when they're younger, growing up, through adolescence, they're generally jet black.
Yeah.
And as they mature, they can be, and the most common color is the reddish brown color. So
Yeah.
they either do that. Sometimes you'll see them as they're changing colors. A few times I've heard witnesses talk about seeing a couple different colors on them. Mostly black with patches of the reddish brown, and it could be they're going through that change, from adolescence to adulthood. Maybe that's something, and we don't know for sure, but that could be a marking of going from adolescence to adulthood. But oftentimes they'll stay black as adults, the hair color. So
Yeah.
but we have the range all the way black, brown, reddish brown, which is the most common, to gray and white, which are the fewest.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the same thing with humans too. I mean, some people that I know were born with like light blonde hair, and then it turns out to be dark, a brown hair,
Right.
or vice versa, and everything. So I guess that's true with every species, I guess.
Yeah, it's just variation in the species.
Hey, one of the things I wanted to ask you too, because going through your this book, I think this is your first book, but going through it again, you talk about how there were certain periods in your life that you just kind of like put the subject away, and even not to get too personal, but I know that you were talking about in your book, you talk about like Alice and how you didn't really want to bring it up to her at first, and then you kind of put the subject away for a while, and then sort of a lot of people kind of urge you later on, okay, hey, Will, write about what you know, like write about your experiences. Like, how long did it take for you to get to the point where you wanted to write that first book?
Well, it wasn't until after Renee Hinden passed away. I got out of the Army in the mid-'80s and moved to Vancouver, and I was going through a divorce, and life was just kind of a mess in general at the time. So a friend there said, well, why don't you come down and stay for a while, clear your head, if you like it, stay, So I did, loved the area, and then I met her, Alice, and I wasn't really doing anything, I mean, other than just kind of, putting my life back on track, kind of going a new direction, going away from the divorce and everything. So I spent a lot of time with her and her 3 children, great kids. In fact, I'm still in touch with her son. But we were sitting and talking one evening. She says, it's really great you spend so much time with me and the kids, but there must be something you'd like to do for yourself, your own hobbies or whatever. And I was thinking to myself, gee, do I tell her? Or I really like this woman. I don't want to ruin the relationship. So I thought, well, I don't want to hide things from her, so I just kind of blurted it out and told her. And she thought it was great. She really encouraged me to do that. So I thought, well, it's just kind of it's interesting. Didn't know. I mean, I knew, of course, about Mount St. Helens in that area, but so I wrote to John Green and Renee Hinden separately. And of course, by this time, I knew that there was a big split between them. So individually, they wrote back, of course, and they both thought it was great that I was there, and they both said that there hadn't been a Sasquatch hunter in the area since Roger Patterson. So I thought that was very encouraging. Kind of nice to pick up the reins, from Roger Patterson. And we put the flyers out on cars. The kids put the flyers out on cars all over our part of town, and it got to a newspaper editor from a newspaper in the Columbia River Gorge, and he did a big 2-page article about me, first one that was ever done, and his newspaper photographer was actually from that area, and he took me out and showed me places where he knew people in the area, growing up with them, where they had seen things. So that was my starting point. And it was in the Washougal River area, so I started working north, up on the border area of Clark and Skamania counties in southwest Washington. And it wasn't too long, only a few weeks before we started finding footprints in the snow. And, one thing led to another, and that's how I ended up. But it wasn't until 2001, and I never thought about writing or anything back then. I was just interested in doing the field work.
Mhm.
So by 2001, when Renee passed away, an old friend of mine from Vancouver moved back from Missouri, and we reconnected, and we were talking one time. I went to visit him. I was living back in the Puget Sound area, and I drove down to visit him in Vancouver, and we were talking over lunch, and he says, you know, with Renee gone, he says, you're the only one that knows a lot of the stuff that you two guys talked about, and he says you need to put it in books. So I'm still dabbling. There's still a lot of things that I know that I haven't put into books
Right.
that I'm thinking about. I mean, eventually I will.
Yeah.
I guess it's sort of a case that I'm still using all this stuff, and it's not wanting to give away trade secrets, so to speak.
Yeah. And I know that, you know, like some people, authority figures that I know that you don't want to give up their names or anything like that, you know.
Yeah, my sources I would never give away
Yeah,
their
yeah,
identities.
yeah. So yeah. So definitely don't want you to do that. Hey, but going back to your first encounter.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is also something. Well, actually, you know what? I have a lot of. I don't think we're going to get to them all tonight. We can save them for next
Sure.
week. That's great. That's great too. But you know, going back to the first encounter. So when you found the first footprints at the railroad track,
Right.
and you went back to John's dad's house, and then he came out and he came out with a camera, and of course he brought his gun just for protection and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let me ask you, did he know exactly at that time what they were, even though that he didn't want to tell you guys are little kids, you know, he didn't want to tell you, oh, this is a monster, this is Bigfoot. But do you think that he knew exactly what it was?
You know, that's interesting because now I think about it. Of course, you know, we were 14 at the time in 1972, me and John and my friend Mark. We didn't really think about it because, I mean, my dad, you know, if we were going to go out traipsing off in the brush someplace, a lot of times he would bring a rifle. It would depend on what was going on, what we were doing. So when John's dad, and we told him we found these footprints and the animal guts and all this stuff, I'm not sure what he thought about. I didn't think about it at the time, or even much later I didn't think about it. But something was triggered in his mind where he needed to grab both the camera and a gun.
Right.
So we ended up going out there, and then he looked very serious when he was looking over the tracks. And he was taking pictures, and he did all this stuff, and all these kids, you know, were all standing around, and not really, you know, we're too busy looking at the tracks on the ground and searching the area, the immediate area. And then he kind of looked at us, he said, you know, he told us, he says, well, this is what I think these are. He didn't say how he knew this stuff. I'm assuming he saw something on television or read an article or something, but he told us he thought these were Bigfoot tracks. And then we're like, yeah, they're big, but what are they?
Yeah.
He says, and we're like, no, that they call it Bigfoot. And we're like, wow, holy cow.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, in this book too, I love how you include the Nathan Rio photo.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you say like it's basically what you saw, only minus the hair covering. But how when you saw this thing, how are these things? How bare were their faces? Because I know that the Patterson film, it's just they're basically hair except for their bottom of their nose to their eyes, basically. But
yeah, pretty much. That's pretty much what I saw. Well, you know, what you see in the Patterson film is pretty close to what I saw. The only difference is I'm pretty sure what I saw was male, and I based that on the distribution of the weight in the body. Because
bigger shoulders.
Yeah, when you look at the Patterson Sasquatch, the shoulders are kind of slumped, and the bottom, the midsection is a little larger than that part. What I saw was it was very massive, more squared shoulders. I mean, very big, very wide shoulders, you know, with the head sitting directly in the middle of that, no neck or anything like that. And I wouldn't say that it tapered down. I mean, it was like this massive trunk, you know, and the legs just sort of, they were part of that. You know, it wasn't really much of a taper, but yeah, I mean, it was, and the hair was very thick, and it covered most of the face, covered, you know, all but I'd say you know, the nose and around the eyes.
Yeah. Hey, and I'm looking on This is it doesn't say the page number here. Well, anyways, though, that's a cool picture that you have of you and Willie in that
Oh,
picture.
then that was taken right about that time too.
Yeah,
That
no,
was
1974 it says. Yeah,
yeah,
yep,
yeah.
yeah. That's a cool. Yeah, he was a cool dog, huh?
He was, yeah, he was a character. We were talking about him last night. That dog, he did some crazy things. We
Well,
lived, we lived. There were between 10 and 30 acre parcels that the people owned in the area, and I remember 2 farms over from ours. One afternoon we were out, and it was summertime, and I looked across the pastures and I see this kind of a large group of something moving, and they're heading our direction. And as they get closer, I see it's my dog, and he's herding 16 piglets to our house, and he gets them all the way to the yard. And I looked at him, and I said, "Willie, take those back." And he turned around, and he herded them back across the field. I'm like, and number one, he acted like he understood. And I thought, what are you doing? You're bringing somebody else's animals to us.
yeah,
But he would do things like that. He was a character.
yeah, yeah. I'm going to kind of skip ahead to some of my
Sure.
the questions here, but I just revisited it because I know you talk about it in this book, but the whole incident where the whole incident with Hugh, the guy who had a
Brown.
Sasquatch, yeah, he had a Sasquatch run up to him, like charge him, and then all of
Right.
a sudden stop. That was a fascinating story. If you want to tell that to the listening audience, I know that I've heard it before, but
Yeah, Hugh that's one of my favorite ones.
yeah,
I've heard a lot over the years, but that's one that really sticks out because Hugh was visibly shaken when we went to the spot. All that started, and I can't remember. It was 1988. We were off with Datus Perry from Carson, and Datus was not very reliable when it came to information. And we'll just leave it at that. So me and him and another friend named Carlo from Portland were hiking all over this region north of Stevenson, Washington. And I had just gotten to the point where I was just frustrated and angry because we'd done this so many times with Datus, and nothing ever panned out that he said. So I kind of walked ahead. I was leaving the two of them chit-chatting on this logging road, and I was trying to scout ahead to see if I could see any, try to salvage the trip. And a couple of young guys come along on dirt bikes, and they stopped to say hello, and I just kind of blurted out to them. I said, "If you guys ever see a Bigfoot in the area or know somebody who has?" And the first guy was like, "Nah, I don't believe any of that stuff." And the other guy kind of held his chin for a minute, and he was thinking, and he says, "Well, one of my buddies saw one just a couple of weeks ago." And I said, "Oh, really?" I said, "Would he be willing to talk about it?" And he says, "I think so." He says, Let me get your number, and I'll talk to him, and I'll give you a call." So a day or two later, he called me, and he says, "Yeah, come on out to Stevenson, and we'll, Hugh's here at the house, and we can talk. He'll talk to you, and he'll take you out there and show you where he saw this thing." So my friend Carlo and I, we drove out there, picked Hugh up. We talked a little bit. And he says, "Oh yeah," and he says, "Let's go out there. I'll show you the place." So he drove across the Bridge of the Gods into northern Oregon, in a little area called Wyeth, and which there's nothing there. I mean, it's just a couple of open areas of pasture and mostly forest. And he explained, he just took us to the spot, and the story was he was supposed to, this other guy Kevin told him to go there and look at some steam vents. Well, they weren't. He was thinking they were volcanic steam vents, and they weren't. They were. It was an old logging landing that had been covered with dirt, and when that material gets wet, the decay causes steam. So that's what the steam was caused from. So they were standing there, and they heard this scream, this bellow come up from down. You could see the Columbia River from up there, and they heard this noise. They didn't know what to make of that. And periodically, it would continue to scream coming up the ridge towards them. And at one point, about 150 yards away, there was a small, kind of a clearing in the brush where they could see in it, and they saw this black figure run across this little opening. And thinking it was a bear, Kevin's friend ran for the car. He didn't want to encounter a bear. So Hugh stood there and just kind of, he says, I don't know why I stood there. I just kind of, I guess I wanted to get a better look to make sure, see if it was a bear, because I didn't see it. I wasn't sure. So this thing kept making these noises, these screams as it was getting closer. And pretty soon a deer pops out of the brush from the direction this noise is coming from, and it runs right over and stands next to Hugh. He said I could have reached out and touched it. And then it bolts. And moments after it bolted, took off running, hit this thing come out of the same spot in the tree line where the deer had come out. It looks at Hugh and it makes a dead run at him. And he says, I don't know if I was in shock or what. He says, I just stood there. I froze. And it was a little slope where he was standing going down towards the Columbia River, or towards the tree line. So this thing was slightly below him, and it come over in front of him, and it stood there, maybe 10 feet away. So they were almost eye to eye because it was standing lower by a few feet. And he said it just stood there and looked at him for a few moments. And he said, I just looked back. He said, then finally it just kind of turned to its right and walked off into the timber. He says, that's when I got my senses and I ran for the car.
Yeah. That's typical for a lot of gorillas that I've heard about in the wild. They'll do that.
Yeah, and especially, if you stand your ground, it's like calling it a bluff. That's why they call it a mock charge. It's a bluff charge.
Right, yeah. Interesting.
But they both threw sketches. In the book, the sketches are in there both. Him and his friend each drew a sketch in there, and they're both on there.
Yeah, I mean, that is pretty terrifying itself. I mean, I can imagine that.
And watching him tell the story on the spot, on the location, I mean, you could see he was terrified. That's why, his story always stuck out in my mind as one of my, one of the more interesting ones, just because of the way he related it. And you could see he was visibly very shaken.
Yeah. On that note, too, I mean, what do you think, or what are your thoughts about? Okay, let's just say that somebody is on a camping trip, and they suddenly realize that they're in the presence of these things. Is the best thing to just run and panic, or just close down your shelter and just stay safe for that?
Well, if you're afraid to be there, the first advice would be to, first of all, act like they're not there. Act like you don't know anything's going on. Calmly pack your stuff up and just leave. If you run in terror, that's not a good thing to do in the presence of any predator, because that's like the ringing the dinner bell. Right. Yeah. It's like telling them that that you're open for business, basically, huh? Yeah. I mean, but if you act calm and do your best to act calm anyway. And certainly don't be there by yourself, but if you happen to be, by yourself or with one other individual, talk out loud like you're talking to other people while you're doing that. So, I mean, there's ways of getting out of those situations calmly. Right, right. One of the things I wanted to also, I guess we're kind of getting close to the end of time, but maybe we have maybe 10, 15 more minutes. We get about 10 minutes or so, yeah. Yeah, yeah. So the whole, you talk about Martin Elliott. Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And what he says is really, really fascinating. He says that he had an encounter, of course, and he says, I went through my whole life not telling anyone because I didn't want to be perceived as crazy. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really probably the case with a lot of witnesses. Very common. And what I find fascinating, though, is that I talk about this guy. I'm not sure if anybody maybe listening has ever heard of an author named Malcolm Gladwell. And he's written, I do a whole presentation on all of his books, but he's written several famous books and everything. But his first book was called The Tipping Point. And basically what he kind of says is that you get to a certain point with anything, with a product, with with whatever. And it gets to he uses a lot of business examples, but I think the same thing is true with a lot of these Bigfoot encounters, which is that
at a certain point, you get to a lot of people that have these stories that they've kept in the closet forever, 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 you know. And then at a certain point, when all of a sudden people start talking about opening the closet and start talking about what happens, it's a tipping point, meaning that like all of these other stories from other people are going to come out because now they don't feel so ashamed. And I really think that's true with this subject. I think that there's a tipping point now that's happening where it used to be taboo, like you didn't want to talk about it.
Oh, yeah.
And now everybody is talking about their stories, and it's coming out, and people are not afraid to talk about their stories anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. I've interviewed people who, I was thinking one gentleman, his daughter contacted me, and his account was around 1948. And hadn't talked to anyone all these years, and then I was able to speak to him and do the interview. But yeah, I mean, people, it's because, and when I interview people, I get a lot of response back because somebody will hear somebody talk about something, and they'll say, well, that's really similar or identical to what happened to me.
Yep.
And in a lot of ways, it's very therapeutic.
Exactly. And also it goes to the point, too, where the question, which is how reluctant are neighbors to talk to one another about what they see?
I think they're pretty reluctant because, you don't want your neighbor thinking you're a nut.
Yeah.
And I think that's what people think, but you don't know what the neighbor has experienced. If you've experienced something, you can almost bet that they've experienced something, too.
Yeah, but it's that whole thing where they don't want to say anything to a neighbor that might not be extremely friendly with them,
and sometimes the neighbors may not be, even though they've seen something, they may not want to talk about it either. So they'll shut down the person approaching them, their other neighbor.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily that they'll shut them down or like, insult them or something like that. They just don't want to talk about it. No?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Also, this is kind of interesting too. With this is something that I've always wondered. In fact, this is something that I'm going to have to go back and I want to kind of retweak our screenplay a little bit, and also not just this one, but I want to retweak all of my screenplays a little bit. Mm-hmm. But because I think this would make it a lot more interesting, but. Because I didn't really catch this the first time when reading In Search of the Unknown, but now I'm kind of catching it a little bit more in Notes from the Field. But about when you had that first encounter and you met that kid on a school bus, and he kind of introduced you to all of these things. Okay, first of all, who was that kid? I mean, do you think that he had any knowledge about these creatures beforehand?
No, I knew Jim. Jim was an old friend.
Okay.
He was somebody, we hung out with each other, I think in the 6th and 7th grade. And then, sometimes you move, you change friends periodically through school. And there was a point where Jim and I didn't hang out much anymore. And then John and I were hanging out. And I had another group of friends. But I was still friends with Jim. He just happened to overhear us. And Jim was into a lot of esoteric subjects.
Right.
Pretty smart guy. He was kind of a loner and didn't have many friends, but he was always into things, searching out new information, new subjects and stuff. So very curious mind. When he overheard John and I talking quietly that night on the after school bus, he asked to interview me. So I thought, well, I know Jim. It's not going to go anyplace. So sure, why not? And not long after he did the interview, I think it was a couple of days, he approached me and he says, "Here, you might want these." So he gave me John Green's 3 books, and kind of the rest is history from there. Because I was astonished. I didn't think there was that much information written on, the footprints and things we'd seen.
Yeah. I mean, I know that you must have been really, really flattered and astonished when you were probably just 18 or whatever, and all of a sudden Renee and John Green come and interview you.
I was 17. Yeah, they came to him and came to the house, and I was shocked. We'll put it that way.
Yeah, that must have been pretty cool, though.
It was very cool. Oh yeah, I was definitely starstruck, no doubt.
Yeah. Hey, also in the book too, you mentioned that 1972 was the year of the Sasquatch. Just out of curiosity, why was 1972 the year?
Oh, that was Green's book. It was
Oh,
published. It was published in 1972. And it was called Year of the
oh,
Sasquatch.
oh, oh, okay. Gotcha. Okay. I see that. Yeah. Yeah, the year of the Sasquatch. Okay. Cool. Well, listen, are we out of time, or do we have time for another?
We got about 5 minutes yet.
Oh, okay. Well, I just wanted to. Well, this might take more than 5 minutes, and maybe we can continue this
Sure.
next too.
Sure.
But I was just going to ask you about the PCSIT. Like, how did that?
Oh.
And I know that. Like, I know about this, but I'm just for the listeners that might be hearing this for the first time.
At that time, this was in when I went to Green and DeHinden's camp after DeHinden and Dennis Gates came to my house that day. So me and another friend drove out to where they told us they were camped, which, by the way, wasn't very far from where Martin Elliott had his encounter. But anyway, I spent the time at the camp, a couple of days. They all packed up, went back to Canada. I went back home. And it really resonated in my mind that these guys who were famous, who were the ones who were spearheading this effort to get to the bottom of these things, wanted me to help them, to be their eyes and ears in the Puget Sound area. So I took that very seriously. I kind of charged with that mission. So I got my buddies together at school, and there were about 10 of us that were in our group. And I remember before starting school in September, I came up with this name, and there was only at that time one other organized effort, and it was called the Bay Area Group here in California. And so we were really the next one, not very well known, but we were the only, besides the Bay Area Group, the only other organized group doing this. So I came up with the name. It was the Pierce County Sasquatch Investigation Team, which later I reincarnated it to become the Pacific Coast Sasquatch Investigation Team. So it basically, the name describes our region and what we were about. So, that we were the Pacific Coast, and we were a Sasquatch Investigation Team. So that's sort of where that all came from.
Yeah. We could get into some of the more specific stories and so forth, because I know that you talk about that a lot.
Sure.
in your book. But we could maybe save that for next week. But hey, maybe just like one last question for tonight.
Sure.
Let me see here. Well, one thing I wanted to kind of address, like, real quick, is that we have so many stories and so many shows like this of us watching them. Mm-hmm. But it is funny when you kind of think about it. If you reverse the situation, they probably spend a lot of time and information, like, and a lot of curiosity about us. They probably they see us, like, some of us hunting deer. They see some of us camping. They see some of us with young children. Mm-hmm. They see some of us, like, old men hunting. They see some of us, Native Americans. I mean, they must be just completely confused by our race,
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure they spend a lot of time observing what we do, too.
Yeah. It is kind of funny when you think about it from their perspective. Not that I think that they're, anything special, but... But it is kind of funny.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Well, Brian, I think we're pretty much out of time.
Yeah. We'll definitely pick up on this next week. And like I said, anybody that wants me on the show to ask Will a question, just remember my email address is just orlandooutsider@yahoo.com. Orlando Outsider, one word, no dashes or dots, just orlandooutsider@yahoo.com.
Yeah, I think that'd be great. I'll put that on Facebook too. That way, we get some questions generated, and that's until we, and well, not just until, but even while we're doing when we do a call-in or start the live call-in shows, it's always great to have people, send in questions.
Yeah.
For these regular weekly spots, or even to incorporate into a live call-in show to help, maybe generate more conversation.
Absolutely. And of course, I can't be the only person that has a lot of great questions out there. I'm sure there are a lot of people out there with a lot better questions than what I can provide. So yeah, definitely.
Your questions are pretty good though, Brian.
Yeah. All right.
All right. Well, let's wrap it up. Thanks again, Brian. We'll talk to you again next week, buddy.
Okay. Sounds good. All right. See you next Wednesday.
All righty.
All right. Bye.
Thanks everyone for joining me this week. Be sure to tune in again next week as we explore another account from a witness of the unknown.